Alright, I'm just doing this one off the cuff here, so no script, no notes, just doing it. And for this Tomcast, I want to talk about how the things you do the most and the things you spend money on aren't necessarily the best indicators of what you want. I think probably the best example of that is like taxes. Everyone is paying their taxes, but if you talk to like a gaming executive who looks at the numbers and is like, oh, what are people constantly buying and spending money on? Well, everyone's paying their taxes, unless they're committing tax fraud, in which case it would be the executive. But that doesn't mean it's fun. The correlation between the things that you do all the time and the things that you enjoy doing and the things that you think of yourself as, I should say, like the things you identify with, they are not necessarily connected. A lot of people spend money on things they don't like because they feel like they have to or because they actually have to. And there's things people do that they enjoy, but they don't necessarily like define themselves by it. Like there's some days when the best part of my day is, the shit I take at the end of it. I don't consider myself a shitologist. I'm not a poop guy. I don't build my life around my throne, if you will. I don't have a bidet. Like, this isn't like a very complicated concept when you just slowly start to break it down. Really, this is just a big cautionary tale in metrics and what you measure and how that all comes back into the feedback loop of what you decide to do more of. Yeah, there might be a moment when you're looking at the metrics and you're like, oh, this is actually giving me an insight. But, you have to make sure that the correlation makes sense. And, part of this, comes down to like the the fact that you can find a lot of correlations in the world, but if you don't have a philosophical or scientific sort of basis, I'm kind of conflating the two because in video games you don't always have a scientific reason why people like something. There's a lot of game design that's very much in the realm of the idea of the thing is more important than the thing itself. So sometimes the philosophy is important. When all that comes together, there can be indicators that you're doing those things, and those are good indicators to have. But just because you have indicators of something doesn't mean you should optimize for it. This sort of goes back to, like, I think it's a Goodhart's law, and that is the idea that when the measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good target. You see this also a lot in, like economic data will come out. Like, there's been a lot of sort of concept of like economic data in the news, and it can be weird because sometimes people will feel like the economy is doing poorly, but you're like, oh, but like all the numbers are going up. Like, why do you feel like the economy is doing poorly? And it can be things like, well, it's not as good for me as it is for you, or this the situations for investors is great, but only I think it's only like 60% of the people in the United States own stock in any measure, and the majority of the stock is only held by like less than 10% of people. So really, when you look at these, stock market indicators, it's like, well, you're talking about a very small group of people that's actually seeing any benefit from that. And many times, the numbers can be going up, but like, going up after a market crash doesn't really mean all that much because things were a lot better beforehand and it's just trying to get back to normal. For an investor, they see that as like, oh, this is a great like growth opportunity. But for like the average person living through it, they're just like, well, I guess things aren't as bad as they were yesterday, but like the year before things were doing fine and I was still employed and all this other stuff. And I know that's true. It's just the difference now is that a few more people, have jobs. So I guess it's getting a little bit better. So back to the video game sense of things. You see this a lot in like the free to play games where they'd have the initial concept of the game, it comes out, and then they do their initial monetization strategy. They put the game out. That's normally the best version of the game that ever comes out. And then in the second year, they realize they're not making as much money as they wanted to, and so they just crank the dial on the monetization up as high as they can go, trying to make as much of their money back. And they kind of realize the game's going to be shit, and they just do this because they're just going to crash the game to the ground and hope they made a profit and they all stay and they all keep their jobs. And the reality of it is, so when it comes to people making hiring and firing decisions, most of the time they just let everyone go anyway, so it's not necessarily the best idea. I think the final part of it really comes down to the fact that, and I've said this probably a million times and you're sick of it, but if you're making a game for money, you're doing it the wrong way. Money should not be the target. It should not be your indicator of success when you're making a video game, when you're making an expression of yourself, or an expression of an idea, expression of philosophy, expression of whatever. The money is obligatory. You need to make money in a sense to keep going. But if you're doing it for the money, and I know you've heard me say this before, just start a bank. People just give you money when you start a bank. It's crazy. I'm sure if I had more notes, I would have a little bit of a longer one to talk about for this one, but uh, we need a shorter Tomcast. These take way too long to edit. That's all I got to say.